A millionaire CEO ordered a portrait for his fiancée. When he came to collect it, the artist was his ex, and beside her stood their daughter, whom he never knew existed. "Hi, my beautiful family, may the Almighty surround you with a love that never weakens and a strength that never breaks. May every woman be honored, protected and lifted, because she is the heart of the family, the quiet courage behind every victory, the grace that turns pain into hope. May your health be renewed, your homes be filled with peace, and your lives be guided by light even in the darkest moments. May respect follow you, love find you daily, and blessings rest gently on your soul. If your heart is true, like the video. If your love is real, comment and stand with Mr. Peter." The art gallery smelled of linseed oil and expensive perfume, but Mark Roberts barely noticed as he pushed through the heavy glass doors. He was already late for dinner with Diana, his fiancée, and this portrait pickup should have been a quick transaction. The commission had cost him a small fortune, but Diana deserved something special, something that would look perfect in their penthouse once they married next spring. He had specifically requested the city's most sought-after portrait artist, someone whose waiting list stretched for months, someone whose work commanded respect in circles that mattered. The receptionist directed him to the private studio in the back, her smile professional and distant. Mark checked his watch, calculating how quickly he could get out of here, pick up the wine Diana wanted, and still make their reservation. His mind was already moving to tomorrow's board meeting, the quarterly reports, the expansion plans that would triple his company's valuation. Life was exactly where he had worked so hard to build it, every piece falling into place with satisfying precision. Then he opened the studio door and his entire world detonated. Mary Barra stood at an easel, her back to him, her distinctive braids falling down her shoulders exactly as he remembered. For a moment, Mark thought he was hallucinating. That stress had finally broken something in his brain. She wore paint-splattered jeans and a white shirt, her bare feet on the drop cloth, and she was humming something under her breath. Beside her, carefully mixing colors on a palette, stood a little girl with caramel skin and Mark's eyes, his exact eyes, his smile, his dimpled chin. The world tilted sideways. Mary turned, sensing his presence, and the palette slipped from her hands, clattering to the floor. Paint splattered across the canvas. Her face drained of color, going ashen beneath her brown skin, and her hand flew to her mouth. They stared at each other across 6 years of silence, across questions that had haunted him through countless sleepless nights, across a chasm that should have been impossible to cross. The little girl looked up from her paints, her innocent face curious. Mark could not breathe, could not think, could not process what he was seeing. This child, this beautiful child with his features and Mary's complexion and a smile that punched through his chest like a bullet, was maybe 5 years old. She would have been conceived right before Mary disappeared, right before the woman he loved vanished without a trace, without explanation, without giving him any chance to understand. His voice shaking with fury that erupted from somewhere primal, Mark heard himself demand explanations, asking how she could keep this from him, how she could hide his daughter. Mary stepped in front of the child immediately, her body a shield, her eyes blazing with protective fire. She told him to leave, her voice cracking with emotion and rage. The little girl started crying, frightened by the angry stranger's raised voice, and Mary scooped her up instantly, whispering soothing words while glaring at Mark with absolute lethal intensity. Mark's voice rose, all his professional control dissolving into raw anger, shouting that this was his child too, demanding to know why Mary would steal this from him. Security appeared within seconds, moving toward Mark with professional efficiency. He wanted to fight them, wanted to refuse to leave, wanted to demand answers to questions that had burned in him for 6 years. But the little girl was sobbing now, her face buried in Mary's neck, and Mary herself was shaking with tears she refused to let fall. Mark told her he had looked everywhere, searched for months, thought something terrible happened to her, and all this time she was hiding his daughter from him. Mary's voice turned to ice over broken glass as she told him he knew nothing about what happened or why she did what she did. that he did not get to storm into their lives and demand explanations while scaring her baby. Mark corrected her desperately as security pulled him toward the door, saying their baby, she was their baby, asking how Mary could keep her secret. Mary turned her back on him, holding the crying child close, her shoulders rigid with fury and something else Mark could not name. The security guards escorted him out firmly but not roughly, and Mark found himself standing in the gallery's main space, surrounded by expensive art and well-dressed patrons who pretended not to notice the commotion. He walked to his car on autopilot, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip his keys. Through the studio window, he could see Mary sitting on the floor, holding the little girl, both of them crying. The child's small hands patted Mary's face, trying to comfort her mother the way children do when their parents fall apart. Mark's phone buzzed with a text from Diana asking about the portrait, reminding him they would be late for their reservation. He stared at the text message, at his fiancée's name on his screen, at the life he thought he had built. Then he looked back at the window where Mary was finally standing, carrying the child toward the back of the studio. As if sensing his gaze, Mary turned and looked directly at him through the glass. Her expression was not fearful, but defiant, challenging him to try to invade their world, daring him to disrupt the life she had built. She reached up and pulled the curtains closed with one sharp movement, shutting him out completely, erasing him from their space with brutal finality. Mark sat in his car as the sun set, understanding with crystalline clarity that his life had just shattered into pieces he did not know how to reassemble. Somewhere in that studio was his daughter, a child whose name he did not know, whose voice he had barely heard, whose entire existence had been kept secret from him for years, and the woman who did it, the woman he had loved with consuming intensity and mourned like a death, had looked at him with nothing but cold fury and protective rage. He did not go to dinner with Diana. He could not face her, could not pretend everything was normal when his entire world had just been ripped apart and reconstructed in the space of 5 minutes. He drove to his office and locked himself inside, staring at the city lights and trying to understand how the universe could be this deliberately cruel. He had a daughter he never knew existed, a daughter whose mother clearly had no intention of letting him be part of her life. And somewhere in his mind, beneath the anger and betrayal and shock, a small voice whispered the question that would haunt him through the sleepless night ahead. What happened to make Mary run? What could possibly have driven her to choose 6 years of struggle alone over telling him the truth? What had he done, or failed to do, that made disappearing seem like her only option? Chapter 2. The unraveling Mark cancelled everything. The engagement dinner with Diana went unattended, the board meeting was postponed, the expansion plans sat untouched on his desk. He spent the night in his office, unable to face his penthouse apartment with its carefully curated furniture and engagement photos scattered across surfaces that suddenly felt like they belonged to a stranger's life. Everything about his existence suddenly felt like a performance, a carefully constructed facade that had just crumbled to reveal something raw and real and devastating underneath. His mind kept circling back to Mary, to the way she had looked standing in that studio with their daughter. She was thinner than he remembered, her face holding a hardness that had not been there before, lines around her eyes that spoke of stress and struggle. The Mary he knew had been soft in all the ways that mattered, quick to laugh, generous with affection, passionate about her art, but also about life itself. The woman he saw yesterday was a fortress, all sharp edges and protective walls, looking at him like he was a threat, rather than someone who had once held her while she cried about her dreams, who had supported her through her final semester, who had loved her with every fiber of his being. He tried to remember the last time he saw her before she disappeared. They had been planning to meet for dinner after one of his late business meetings. She had texted him that she needed to talk about something important, something that could not wait. Mark had been distracted, buried in negotiations that would determine his company's future, and he told her they would talk over the weekend when he had more time. She had sent back a simple acknowledgement, nothing that suggested anything was wrong, nothing that indicated she was about to vanish from his life forever. When the weekend came, she was gone. Her apartment emptied overnight, her phone disconnected, her friends suddenly evasive when he asked questions. Mark had panicked, convinced something terrible happened to her. He filed a missing person report, hired investigators, searched hospitals and police stations across multiple cities. Everyone told him the same thing: adults have the right to disappear if they want to. There was no evidence of foul play. Mary had clearly chosen to leave, packed her belongings methodically, and if she did not want to be found, they had to respect that decision. Except now he knew she had been pregnant. She had been carrying his child when she vanished, had chosen to face pregnancy and childbirth and single motherhood in isolation rather than give him a chance to be there, to support her, to be part of their daughter's life from the beginning. At dawn, Mark finally called the private investigator he had used before. His voice was rough from lack of sleep as he demanded everything: where Mary had been for the past 6 years, how she supported herself, medical records if possible, school records for the child, every detail that could be found. The investigator was efficient, discreet, and expensive. Within hours, the first reports started arriving by secure email. Each one felt like a knife to Mark's chest, revealing a story of struggle and survival that made his anger twist into something more complex and painful. Mary had moved across the country immediately after disappearing, settling in a city where she knew no one, where she had no support system or safety net. She had been pregnant when she arrived, working overnight shifts as a hospital janitor to pay rent on a tiny studio apartment in a neighborhood that the investigators' notes described as barely safe. Employment records showed she worked 7 days a week through her entire pregnancy, right up until she went into labor at her janitorial job and was rushed to the hospital by co-workers who barely knew her name. Hospital records showed she had checked herself in alone at midnight, given birth without anyone beside her holding her hand or coaching her breathing, and checked out barely 12 hours later against medical advice. The doctor's notes mentioned concerns about her leaving so soon, about her obvious exhaustion, about her lack of support system, but Mary had signed herself out anyway because she could not afford another night's hospital stay. After the birth, she had somehow added a morning shift at a downtown diner to the overnight janitorial work, surviving on fragments of sleep while caring for an infant. The investigator found old social media posts from the diner, staff photos from holiday parties, and Mary was there in the background of one image, her face hollow with exhaustion, dark circles under her eyes, their daughter strapped to her chest in a worn carrier. The dates on those photos showed she was back at work within 3 weeks of giving birth, serving breakfast to morning commuters while her newborn slept against her chest. Court records revealed an eviction proceeding when their daughter was about 2 years old. Mary had represented herself in housing court, arguing passionately that she had the rent money but needed a few extra days for her paycheck to clear, that she was a good tenant who had never been late before, that she had a toddler who needed stability. The judge had granted her the extension, notes in the file mentioning her obvious dedication to her child and her credible explanation. Mark wondered what it must have taken for Mary to stand in that courtroom alone, fighting to keep a roof over their daughter's head, doing it all without help when he could have solved the problem with a single phone call if only he had known she existed. But there was more to the story, a shift that happened gradually. Around the time their daughter turned 3, Mary's life began to change. She had started taking freelance art commissions, small portraits and paintings that she completed during the few hours she was not working or caring for a toddler. Word spread about her talent through local galleries and art circles, and the commissions grew larger, more prestigious, commanding higher prices. Eventually, she had been able to quit the janitorial job, then the diner, focusing entirely on her art and her daughter. Her big break came through a gallery showing that featured emerging artists. The investigator included reviews of that show, critics praising Mary's raw emotional power, the way her portraits captured something essential about her subjects, something honest and vulnerable that made viewers feel seen. Within months, she had more work than she could handle, a waiting list of clients willing to pay premium prices. Within a year, she was commanding fees that would have shocked the struggling art student Mark once knew. Now, according to the investigators' current findings, Mary Barra was one of the most sought-after portrait artists on the East Coast. She owned her townhouse outright in a good neighborhood, had savings in the bank, had built a career that supported her and their daughter comfortably. She had done it all herself through sheer determination and talent and refusal to give up, even when circumstances were crushing. Mark should have felt proud of her accomplishments, should have celebrated her success. Instead, he felt hollow and confused, unable to understand why she would choose that path of struggle over simply telling him the truth. His phone rang around noon. Diana. He had been ignoring her calls since yesterday, sending brief texts claiming a family emergency. But he owed her more than evasive messages and broken dinner dates. When she arrived at his office, immaculately dressed as always, her concern was genuine despite the awkwardness of his recent behavior. They had been together for almost 2 years, engaged for 6 months. She was perfect on paper, successful attorney, intelligent, connected to the right families and social circles. Their relationship was comfortable, easy, built on mutual respect and compatible life goals. But it had never been what he had with Mary. It had never consumed him the way Mary did, never made everything else in life feel secondary. Mark told Diana everything, the words pouring out in a confession he had not planned, about Mary disappearing years ago, about the portrait studio, about the daughter he never knew existed, about the investigation revealing years of struggle. Diana listened without interrupting, her face carefully neutral, her hands folded in her lap with lawyer-like composure. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment, processing information that would change both their lives. Then she said something that stunned him into silence. She already knew. His business partner Thomas had told her months ago about Mark's complicated past, about a woman who left and might show up again someday, asking Diana to be patient and understanding about unresolved feelings. Mark felt the ground shift beneath him again. Thomas knew about Mary. How much did he know, and why had he never mentioned it? Diana stood, smoothing her skirt with precise movements that spoke of emotional control. She told Mark she could not compete with a memory that was now real, with a child that connected him to another woman forever. She pulled off her engagement ring, setting it carefully on his desk with a soft click that sounded final. She hoped he found what he was looking for, her voice genuinely kind despite everything, and then she left without drama or accusations. After she departed, Mark sat alone with investigator reports spread across his desk and an engagement ring representing a life that no longer made any sense. His phone buzzed with an email notification. The investigator had found something else, something that made Mark's blood run cold. It was a news article from 6 years ago, dated just days before Mary disappeared. The headline announced Mark Roberts' engagement to Diana Thornton, daughter of Richard Thornton, whose investment firm was crucial to Mark's company expansion. There was a photo of Mark and Diana at some charity event, looking comfortable together, looking like an established couple. But Mark had not been dating Diana back then. He barely knew her, had met her maybe twice at industry functions. This engagement had been his business partner's idea, a strategic announcement to secure Thornton's investment, a deception Mark had argued against, but eventually agreed to because Thomas convinced him it was temporary theatre that would be quietly retracted once the deal closed. It was supposed to be business, nothing personal, a facade that would last a few weeks at most, except the retraction never happened. The fake engagement had somehow become real over time, so gradually Mark had not noticed the shift from performance to actual relationship. And Mary, pregnant with his child, would have seen that announcement and believed he had chosen someone else, chosen his company over her, chosen everything except the family they could have built together. Chapter 3. The Volcanic Confrontation. Mark did not wait for Thomas Laurent to arrive at the office for their scheduled meeting. He went to the man's house in the early morning darkness, when the world was still quiet and there were no witnesses to what he needed to say. Thomas answered the door in an expensive robe, his expression shifting from surprise to calculation when he saw Mark's face, when he recognized the barely controlled fury in his former friend's eyes. They sat in Thomas's pristine living room surrounded by modern art and designer furniture, and Mark threw the articles, the timeline, all the evidence across the glass coffee table with enough force to make Thomas flinch. He demanded the truth, his voice hard and uncompromising, wanting to know exactly what Thomas had done to drive Mary away 6 years ago. Thomas had the audacity to look confused at first, attempting innocence, but Mark was done with games and pretense. Thomas's mask cracked quickly under pressure. He admitted he did what needed to be done to save the company, to protect Mark from throwing everything away for a girl who was completely wrong for him, a girl with no connections or resources or anything that would help build what they were creating. His voice took on that persuasive boardroom tone as he leaned forward, explaining that Mary being pregnant before Mark was ready would have tied him to a woman who did not fit their world, would have complicated everything right, when the Thornton investment depended on Mark presenting a certain image. Mark's fury built with every word. Thomas actually admitted to driving Mary away deliberately, to cornering her after she saw the engagement announcement, to telling her that Mark's future depended on the Thornton money and that a pregnant girlfriend from a poor background would destroy everything. Thomas claimed Mary came to him crying, asking if the engagement was true, and he confirmed it was real, suggested that if she truly loved Mark, she would let him go, let him build his empire without the burden of a child he was not ready for. Mark's voice shook as he asked how Thomas could tell a pregnant woman that her child was unwanted, that she was a complication to be removed. Thomas stood, pacing with agitated energy, his composure finally cracking as he insisted he told her the truth, that Mark was consumed by the company and not ready to be a father, that Mary would have destroyed everything they worked for. He actually had the nerve to claim vindication, pointing out that Mark had become one of the most successful young business leaders in the country, achieving everything they planned. Mark told him flatly that he wanted Mary, would have chosen her over all of it, would have walked away from the company if it meant keeping his family. Thomas's face flushed as he shouted back that this was exactly why he could not let Mark make that choice, that Mark would have thrown away his potential for some struggling art student and a baby that would have tied him down for decades. Thomas claimed he saved Mark from himself, protected their investment, ensured the success they now enjoyed. Mark stood slowly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, fighting the urge to physically attack someone he once called his closest friend. He told Thomas he was done, fired, that he wanted him packed and gone by end of business, that if Thomas fought him on this, Mark would destroy him completely. Thomas's face went pale as Mark promised to expose every unethical manipulation, every lie, ensuring Thomas would never work in their industry again. Thomas stammered about contracts and equity and legal protections, but Mark did not care. Thomas had stolen his family, had robbed him of 6 years with his daughter, had forced the woman he loved into poverty and struggle. Legal consequences were nothing compared to what Thomas deserved. Mark left Thomas standing in that perfect living room, probably already calling lawyers and planning defense strategies. He did not care about any of it. Thomas was finished, and Mark would make absolutely certain he paid for what he had done. But knowing the truth about the manipulation did not solve Mark's real problem. Mary still hated him, still believed he had abandoned her, or at least had not cared enough to find her, and Mary was clearly not going to let him anywhere near their daughter without a serious fight. He drove to Mary's townhouse knowing he was pushing boundaries, knowing she would be furious at him showing up unannounced again. But he needed her to understand what happened, needed her to know the full truth about the manipulation. He parked outside and waited, watching as lights came on in the early morning, seeing Mary move around the kitchen through the window, his chest tightening with longing and regret. He knocked just after sunrise. Mary opened the door already dressed for the day, her eyes widening with recognition before narrowing with anger. She demanded to know what he was doing at her home uninvited, her voice cold and unwelcoming. Mark asked for an hour, just 1 hour to explain, mentioning that their daughter was at school so they could talk without traumatizing her further. Mary's jaw clenched at the mention of Abigail, at Mark's presumption of knowledge about their daughter's schedule. Mark told her urgently that he knew what happened 6 years ago, knew what Thomas had told her, knew about the fake engagement and all the manipulation. He explained that he had fired Thomas, burned that bridge completely, and needed Mary to understand that he never knew she was pregnant, never knew about any of Thomas's interference. Mary told him to leave, her voice sharp, but Mark pushed past her into the townhouse, ignoring her protests because he was desperate and running out of options. Mary slammed the door and whirled to face him, her composure cracking as she demanded to know what he wanted, what credit he expected for finally figuring out what happened. Her voice rose as she asked if he wanted forgiveness for being oblivious while she was struggling, if he thought understanding the past somehow erased the present reality. Mark's voice rose to match hers as he shouted that he looked for her, hired investigators, filed police reports, searched for months thinking something terrible had happened. Mary laughed bitterly, the sound harsh and broken, pointing out that he was engaged to Diana Thornton within a year of her disappearing, that he built his empire and moved on perfectly fine without her. Mark grabbed the investigator's report from his jacket, throwing it on her table with force, explaining that the engagement was fake business strategy that somehow became real because he was too destroyed to notice the difference, that he was going through the motions of living while everything inside him was dead. The argument escalated into a volcanic eruption of 6 years of suppressed rage and pain. Mary's voice finally matched Mark's volume as she screamed that she tried to tell him about the pregnancy, that she stood outside his office with the test in her purse while news cameras filmed him with Diana, that Thomas cornered her that same night and made everything crystal clear. She told him she went to his apartment afterward, stood outside his door for an hour trying to decide whether to trust him, and heard him inside on the phone laughing with Thomas about how the fake engagement was brilliant strategy. Mark tried to explain it was about the business deal, but Mary cut him off. Her voice cracked as she asked how she was supposed to know that, how a 23-year-old pregnant woman was supposed to distinguish between business strategy and personal choice, when every piece of evidence told her she was the complication standing between him and everything he wanted. She described making the choice to remove herself from the equation, to let him have his success without the burden of her and their baby. Mark told her she should have trusted him, but Mary demanded to know why, what he had done in those final weeks to earn trust. She pointed out that he was consumed by business meetings, cancelling plans constantly, barely present when they were together, telling her they would talk about her important news over the weekend like she was a problem to be scheduled. She said she felt like she was losing him before the engagement announcement, that it just confirmed her fears that she was not enough for him. Mark argued it was not fair, but his voice had lost its conviction, because he was beginning to see her perspective, beginning to understand how his obsession with success had created perfect conditions for Thomas's manipulation to work. Mary's tears streamed down her face now as she described giving birth alone, holding their daughter by herself with no one there to tell her she was strong, no one to care whether she lived or died. She described going back to work when their daughter was weeks old, strapping the baby to her chest and scrubbing toilets on night shifts. She described fighting an eviction when Abigail was 2, standing before a judge begging for more time, terrified of losing their apartment and having nowhere to take her baby. Her voice broke completely as she told him she built a life from nothing through sheer determination, survived when survival seemed impossible, made sure Abigail had everything she needed even when Mary had nothing. She described painting until her hands cramped, taking commissions when too exhausted to stand, building a career because she refused to let their child grow up poor and powerless like she did. Mark told her quietly that he would have been there for all of it if he had known, but Mary's response was brutal in its honesty. He did not know because he was too focused on his empire to notice the woman he claimed to love was falling apart. Mary told him he did not get to rewrite history now, pretending he would have been some perfect father when he chose his company over her every single day. Mark tried to protest, but Mary forced him to think honestly about what would have happened if she told him about the pregnancy back then, with the Thornton deal pending and Thomas whispering about liabilities. She asked if he really would have walked away from everything he worked for, or if he would have convinced himself he could have both and ended up doing neither well. Mark opened his mouth to argue, but stopped, confronted with a truth he had been avoiding. He had been obsessed with success back then, working 18-hour days, sleeping in his office, missing important moments because there was always one more meeting that seemed critical. He remembered feeling irritated when Mary said she needed to talk about something important, remembered thinking her timing was terrible. The realization was devastating. Mary wrapped her arms around herself, looking exhausted and hollowed out. She acknowledged that maybe he was not that person anymore, but that was who he was back then, and that was who she had to make decisions about. She told him she gave him his freedom, let him build everything he wanted without the burden of a family he was not ready for, and she did not regret that choice, even if it cost her everything. What she regretted was him forcing himself back into their lives now, scaring their daughter, creating chaos when they had finally found peace. Mark desperately corrected her, saying our daughter, insisting Abigail was his too and that he wanted to know her, wanted to be her father. Mary looked at him with an expression mixing grief and anger, telling him being a father was not about biology, but about showing up every day, being present for hard moments, putting someone else's needs first. She pointed out she had been Abigail's entire world since birth, while he was a stranger who yelled and made her mother cry. She asked why she should let him anywhere near their daughter, and Mark's voice was raw as he admitted he loved Abigail already, despite knowing her for only 5 minutes, that he had no right to ask, but was asking anyway for a chance to prove he could be the father she deserved. Mary was silent for a long time, emotions warring across her face. Finally, she agreed to one chance, but with absolute conditions. Abigail's well-being came first, always, and if Mark was inconsistent or brought chaos, Mary would cut him off completely and disappear where he would never find them. She told him to come to Riverside Park on Saturday morning at 9, warning that if he was late or angry, there would be no second chance. Mark left her house with his emotions in turmoil, understanding that he had some answers, but they brought no relief, only crushing weight of all his failures. Chapter 4. The Daughter. Saturday morning arrived with painful slowness after days of Mark barely sleeping, his mind cycling through everything he learned and everything he should have done differently. He had researched how to talk to children, what 5-year-olds enjoyed, how to make good first impressions without overwhelming them. None of it felt adequate for the monumental task of meeting his daughter properly, of somehow proving he deserved a place in her life despite missing her first 5 years. He arrived at Riverside Park 45 minutes early, unable to bear the thought of being even a second late and losing this opportunity. The park was beautiful in the morning light, families already gathering for weekend activities, children's laughter carrying across open spaces like music. Mark found an empty bench with clear view of the main playground and waited, his heart pounding with anxiety he had not felt since his first major business presentation years ago, when everything depended on making the right impression. At exactly 9 o'clock, he saw them approaching. Mary walked toward the playground holding a small hand, both of them dressed casually in jeans and bright shirts, both moving with easy synchronization that spoke of deep connection and years of practice. The little girl was chattering animatedly about something, her free hand gesturing wildly in that uninhibited way children have, and Mary was laughing at whatever story she was telling. They looked perfect together, complete, a self-contained unit that had no need for anyone else in their world. Mark stood slowly, suddenly terrified he was making a terrible mistake, that his presence would only damage something beautiful and functional. The child noticed him first, her steps slowing, her small body tensing with recognition of the man who had scared her at the gallery. She said something to Mary, pointing toward Mark with cautious uncertainty, and Mary nodded before crouching down to their daughter's level to say something he could not hear from this distance. Then they approached together, Mary's hand protectively on the child's shoulder, both sets of eyes assessing him with different types of wariness. Mark greeted them quietly, staying where he was and letting them come to him rather than advancing, understanding instinctively that the child needed to feel safe and in control of the distance between them. Mary's voice was carefully neutral as she returned his greeting. Then she looked at their daughter and made introductions. She explained that Mark was someone very important that she knew before the child was born, someone who would like to get to know her if that was acceptable. The little girl studied Mark with serious eyes that were mirror images of his own, her hand gripping Mary's tightly. Finally, she asked in a small voice that carried traces of that earlier fear whether he was the man who made Mama cry at the gallery. The question hit Mark like a physical blow, but he refused to lie to her or deflect responsibility. He admitted yes, he did make her Mama cry, and he was very sorry about that. He explained that sometimes grown-ups have big feelings and complicated conversations that can seem scary, but he promised he was not going to yell or be angry today, that he just wanted to meet her if that was okay. The child asked with childhood's devastating directness why he was angry before, and Mark glanced at Mary, who gave him a slight nod to answer honestly. He crouched down to the child's eye level, careful to maintain respectful distance so he did not crowd her space. He explained that he was sad because he missed a lot of time with her, and sometimes when people are very sad, it can come out as anger. But that was wrong of him, and it was not her fault or her mama's fault, just him having big feelings he did not handle well. The child considered this with 5-year-old seriousness, then informed him that Mama says when she has big feelings, she should use words instead of yelling. Mark felt his throat tighten as he agreed that her Mama was very smart, and that was excellent advice he should have followed. The child's mercurial attention shifted suddenly. She asked if he liked to draw. The topic changed so abrupt it left Mark momentarily off balance. He answered that he did like to draw, though he was not nearly as talented as her Mama, who was an amazing artist. The child announced with absolute confidence that she was going to be an artist too when she grew up, that Mama was teaching her about colors and shapes and perspective, then asked if Mark knew what perspective was with the challenging tone of someone ready to demonstrate superior knowledge. Mark suggested maybe she could explain it to him, sensing that letting her talk about something she was passionate about would help her relax and feel powerful in this interaction. What followed was a surprisingly sophisticated explanation of perspective in art, filtered through 5-year-old understanding, but showing genuine comprehension of concepts. The child pulled a small sketchbook from Mary's bag, the pages filled with crayon drawings of flowers and animals and houses rendered with careful attention. Mark examined each drawing with genuine interest, complimenting specific details, asking questions that made her light up with pride at being taken seriously. She pointed to one drawing as her favorite, explaining it showed her and Mama at the beach under a large sun, mentioning the beach was her favorite place, even though they did not get to go very much because Mama was busy with work. Mark studied the image, noticing how she had used yellow and orange together to make the sun brighter, commenting on her use of color mixing that showed her Mama's teaching. The child explained enthusiastically about color theory at a kindergarten level, and Mark felt pieces of his heart rearranging themselves as he realized this was his daughter, this bright, curious child who loved art and had opinions about technique. After they went through the entire sketchbook, Mark asked if he could see her playground, if maybe she could show him her favorite parts. The child looked at Mary for permission, and Mary hesitated before nodding with the caveat that they stay where she could see them. The child grabbed Mark's hand without hesitation, the casual trust of a child who had decided he was safe, and led him toward the playground equipment. Mary followed at a distance, settling on a bench with clear sightlines. Her body language still protective, but less rigid than when they arrived. For the next hour, Mark played with his daughter, whose name he learned was Abigail. He pushed her on swings, spotted her as she climbed jungle gym structures with fearless confidence, watched her navigate the playground with energy and joy. She talked constantly, telling him about her school and her friends and her pet goldfish and her favorite television shows. Mark absorbed every detail, storing them away like precious treasures, learning who this person was beyond just being his biological daughter, understanding that she was already fully formed with preferences and fears and dreams. Then Abigail asked with childhood's devastating directness why he did not live with them like some of her friends' daddies did. Mark's breath caught, and he glanced toward Mary, who was watching them intently. He asked Abigail if she knew what complicated meant, and she defined it as grown-up stuff she was not supposed to understand yet, but thought she could if someone explained properly. Mark told her carefully that he and her mama used to be very close friends, but sometimes life takes people in different directions, that he lived in a different house because that was how things worked out, but it did not mean he did not care about both of them. Abigail pressed with child logic, asking directly if he wanted to live with them. Mark said carefully that he would love to spend more time with both of them, but that was something her mama and he needed to figure out together in ways that made sure she was happy and safe. Abigail spun the merry-go-round slowly with her foot, then asked which kind of daddy he would be, the kind who lives with her, or the kind who visits sometimes. The question was so innocent but so profound that Mark felt tears prick his eyes. Mary approached, telling Abigail it was time to go because they had lunch plans. Abigail asked hopefully if Mark could come to lunch with them, but Mary said gently, "Not today, maybe another time." Abigail looked disappointed, but did not argue, then hugged Mark suddenly, her small arms wrapping around his neck. She asked if he would come back next Saturday, and Mark looked at Mary silently, asking permission. Mary gave a slight nod, and Mark promised he would definitely be there. Abigail skipped back to Mary, grabbing her hand, and they walked away with Abigail waving enthusiastically over her shoulder. Mark sank onto the park bench, overwhelmed by everything he just experienced. He had a daughter named Abigail who liked to draw and had opinions and asked questions that cut straight to the heart of complex adult problems. He had missed 5 years of her life, 5 years of moments like this, 5 years of watching her grow and learn. But he also understood with clarity that he could not undo the past, could only move forward and prove he deserved to be part of her future. Chapter 5. The Crisis. 4 Saturdays became routine that Mark organized his entire life around. He showed up at Riverside Park precisely on time every week without fail, spending 2 hours playing with Abigail while Mary watched from careful distance. The little girl gradually dropped all wariness, greeting him with enthusiastic hugs that made his chest feel too full, dragging him immediately to whatever activity she wanted to share. They drew together with sidewalk chalk, played elaborate imaginary games, talked about everything and nothing in the way children do when they feel safe. Mark learned that Abigail loved science documentaries about ocean animals, was afraid of thunder but not lightning, sang constantly while she drew, and had inherited his stubbornness along with his eyes and smile. He learned she collected smooth stones from the playground, had memorized all her classmates' birthdays, and wanted to be an artist who also studied marine biology when she grew up because she could not choose just one passion. Mary remained cordial but distant during these visits, exchanging pleasantries about Abigail's week, but never engaging beyond logistics. Mark respected her boundaries, even as he ached to bridge the gap between them, to somehow earn back even a fragment of what they once had. He caught himself watching Mary when she laughed at something Abigail said, remembering why he fell in love with her in the first place, understanding that those feelings had never actually died despite everything. Then on the 5th Saturday, everything changed in an instant that stopped Mark's heart. Abigail ran toward the playground as usual, chattering about the new constellation she learned, but halfway there she stumbled. Mark thought she tripped over her own feet, moved instinctively to help her up, but then her small body went rigid in a way that was completely wrong. Her eyes rolled back, showing only whites. She collapsed to the ground, her limbs convulsing in a seizure that sent Mary into immediate screaming panic. Mary ran toward their daughter, her voice breaking on Abigail's name, dropping to her knees beside the convulsing child. Mark was already on the phone with emergency services, his voice somehow calm despite the terror flooding through him, providing precise information about their location and the medical emergency. He gave clear details about Abigail's age and symptoms, while his hands shook and his mind screamed that his daughter was dying right in front of him. Mary was trying to hold Abigail, but Mark gently moved her hands away, remembering first aid training from years ago. He explained they should not restrain her, just make sure she could not hurt herself on the playground equipment. He pulled off his jacket, wadding it under Abigail's head, turning her carefully on her side. His business training had included emergency response protocols, and he forced himself to stay functional while his heart was shattering into pieces. The seizure lasted less than 2 minutes, but felt like hours of pure nightmare. When it finally stopped, Abigail was limp and unresponsive, her breathing shallow and wrong. Mary was sobbing, saying their daughter's name over and over in a broken voice that Mark would hear in nightmares for months afterward. Mark held Mary back from shaking the unconscious child, his voice somehow steady as he assured her that Abigail was breathing, that the ambulance was coming, that she was going to be okay, even though he had no idea if that was true. The ambulance arrived within minutes that felt like years. Paramedics took over with professional efficiency, loading Abigail onto a gurney, asking rapid-fire questions about her medical history. Mary was barely coherent, her terror overwhelming her ability to communicate clearly. Mark stepped in, providing what information he could while the paramedics worked, then riding in the ambulance with them because Mary was shaking too hard to stand alone. At the hospital, they were immediately surrounded by doctors and nurses, everyone moving with purposeful urgency. Abigail regained consciousness in the emergency room, confused and crying, reaching for Mary. Mary gathered their daughter carefully into her arms, whispering soothing words while tears streamed down her face. Abigail asked what happened in a small, frightened voice, and Mary explained as calmly as she could that she got sick for a little bit, but the doctors were taking very good care of her. Tests were ordered immediately. Blood work, neurological examinations, possibly imaging studies. Specialists were consulted. Terminology was thrown around that neither Mark nor Mary fully understood. They were told Abigail needed to stay overnight for observation, possibly longer depending on test results. A neurological event in a 5-year-old required careful investigation, and the doctors mentioned possibilities ranging from relatively benign to terrifying. Mary told the doctors about a previous incident 2 months ago where Abigail got dizzy and fell, something Mary had thought was just standing up too fast because the pediatrician said it was probably nothing. Now that seemingly minor event took on sinister significance, suggesting a pattern rather than an isolated incident. Mary's guilt and fear spiraled as she wondered if she had missed something serious, if she should have pushed for more tests, if her daughter's illness was somehow her fault. Mark stayed with them through everything, making phone calls to ensure they had access to the best specialists, leveraging every connection he had to get Abigail the highest level of care. He handled logistics while Mary was too numb to function, arranging for a private room, speaking with insurance coordinators, making sure nothing fell through administrative cracks. Mary was too overwhelmed to protest his intervention, too frightened for her daughter to care about pride or independence. That night, they took turns, sitting beside Abigail's hospital bed while she slept fitfully, monitors beeping steadily in the background. The hospital provided a small couch where one of them could rest, but neither really slept. Around midnight, while Abigail was in deep sleep and Mary sat watching her with exhausted vigilance, Mark went to find coffee from the hospital cafeteria that would be terrible, but at least hot. When he returned, Mary was crying silently, tears streaming down her face as she watched their daughter breathe, her hand gently stroking Abigail's hair with infinite tenderness. Mark set the coffee down and simply wrapped his arms around Mary from behind, without asking permission. She stiffened for half a second, then collapsed back against him with a broken sound, letting herself be held for the first time in 6 years, letting someone else carry some of the weight she always bore alone. Her voice was barely a whisper as she admitted she was terrified, explaining that this was why she never wanted to let anyone close. Because if something happened to Abigail, Mary could not fall apart. She had to stay strong, had to handle everything, had to be enough for both of them. But she was so scared, more frightened than she had ever been, not knowing what the tests would show or what any of this meant. Mark told her quietly that she did not have to be strong alone anymore, that he was here, and whatever happened, they would face it together, that she could lean on him now. Mary turned in his arms, burying her face in his chest, and sobbed with 6 years of suppressed fear and loneliness pouring out. 6 years of being strong alone, of handling every crisis by herself, of never having anyone to share the weight, finally broke her open. Mark held her tight, letting her cry, understanding that this was what she had needed for years but never had, this simple human comfort of not being alone in the hardest moments. When she finally calmed, pulling back and wiping her face roughly, she said she could not do this thing between them, could not think about their complicated relationship when Abigail needed her focused entirely. Mark agreed immediately that there was no them right now, only Abigail, that their daughter was all that mattered. They spent the rest of the night in tired silence, both watching Abigail sleep, both terrified of what morning's test results might reveal, but drawing strength from not facing it alone, for the first time, in either of their lives. Chapter 6. The Family Invasion. Abigail's test results came back showing no immediately critical problems. The seizure appeared to have been caused by dehydration and stress. Though her blood work showed some anomalies, the doctors wanted to investigate further. She was released after 2 days with strict medication protocols, warning signs to watch for, and appointments scheduled with a pediatric neurologist for comprehensive evaluation. Mary took her home exhausted and traumatized by how close she came to losing control of the situation. Mark stayed involved, helping with Abigail's care and medication schedule, being present in ways that started feeling almost normal despite the circumstances. He took time off work to support them through follow-up appointments, making meals and handling logistics Mary usually juggled alone. For several days, they existed in a strange domestic bubble where they functioned as parents together, and the forced proximity made clear what both had been avoiding. They still loved each other despite everything. Then Mark's carefully managed world exploded. His secretary called with a warning that made his blood run cold. His mother, Catherine Roberts, was in the lobby demanding to see him immediately. They had barely spoken since Mark took full control of his company and forced out Thomas, and her sudden appearance meant trouble. Catherine walked into Mark's office like she owned it, dressed impeccably as always, her expression mixing concern with calculation in ways Mark had learned to distrust completely. She told him she had been hearing interesting things through social circles, that apparently Mark had a daughter he never mentioned, a 6-year-old living with her mother in a modest townhouse across the city. Mark felt his jaw tighten as he told her coldly that his personal life was none of her concern. Catherine settled into a chair without invitation, explaining that it became her concern when her granddaughter existed and she had not been informed, asking how he could keep such a secret after everything they had been through. Mark demanded to know what she meant by everything they had been through, his voice dangerous. Catherine had the grace to look briefly uncomfortable, admitting that Thomas had exceeded his authority in how he handled Mary's situation. But she maintained that the core concern was valid. Mark was not ready to be a father back then and would have sacrificed everything he worked for. Mark stood so quickly, his chair slammed backward, telling her that was his choice to make, not hers or Thomas's. Catherine continued, as if he had not spoken, explaining that the past was behind them now, and what mattered was that she had a granddaughter she intended to know. Her voice took on steel as she revealed that her lawyers had already drafted custody arrangement proposals for grandparent visitation. Mark felt rage building in his chest as he told her absolutely not, that she would stay away from Mary and Abigail completely, that she had no rights in this situation. Catherine's expression hardened as she pulled out a folder, sliding it across the desk with deliberate precision. She explained calmly that she had every right, that family court favored grandparent relationships, especially when there were concerns about the child's living situation. She referenced Mary's years of struggle, the court records showing an eviction proceeding, medical records showing she gave birth alone and left the hospital prematurely, painting these circumstances as raising legitimate concerns about stability and appropriate parenting. Mark exploded, slamming his hand on the desk with enough force to make Catherine flinch. He shouted that Mary was struggling because Catherine drove her away, that Mary raised Abigail beautifully with no help from anyone, that she was an excellent mother who had survived circumstances Catherine created. Catherine responded with condescending sympathy, suggesting that while Mary surely tried her best, trying was not the same as providing the resources and opportunities Abigail deserved as a Roberts heir. Mark told her to get out with deadly quiet intensity, to leave his office and his life and stay away from his family forever. He made clear that if she pursued this custody battle, she would never see him or Abigail again, that he would cut every tie and burn every bridge without hesitation. Catherine stood, smoothing her skirt with precise movements, telling him he was thinking emotionally rather than rationally, that when he calmed down he would see she was right. She added that the child deserved her heritage, that her lawyers would be in touch, suggesting Mark convince Mary to cooperate because legal battles could be unpleasant, especially when finances were unequal. After Catherine left, Mark immediately called his lawyers, spending an hour understanding the terrible truth. Catherine actually had legal grounds to pursue grandparent visitation rights under state law. Fighting her would be expensive, time-consuming, and would expose every detail of Mary's past struggles to court scrutiny. The lawyer explained that while full custody was unlikely, Catherine could win court-ordered visitation time, possibly extended periods during summers or holidays if she built a strong case. Mark drove to Mary's house without calling first, his mind racing with strategies and fears. When she opened the door looking exhausted from caring for recovering Abigail, he told her immediately they had a serious problem. 20 minutes later, with his lawyer on speakerphone explaining grandparent rights law and custody precedents, Mary understood exactly how bad the situation was. She sat at her kitchen table growing paler with each legal explanation, each description of how Catherine could use the court system against them. When the call ended, Mary looked at Mark with fury blazing in her eyes. She asked with dangerous quiet whether his family was really doing this, whether after everything they were still trying to control her and Abigail. Mark promised he would fix it, would make Catherine back off, but Mary demanded to know how. She pointed out that Catherine had money and lawyers and apparently legal rights Mary did not even know existed, asking what she was supposed to do, how she was supposed to fight his entire family without resources. Mark told her firmly that she would not fight alone, that his lawyer said their best defense was showing a united front. If they presented themselves as cooperating co-parents with shared decision-making, making choices together about Abigail's welfare, then Catherine had no grounds to claim Mary was keeping Abigail from family relationships. Mary repeated slowly that united front sounded like pretending they were together, and Mark clarified not pretending, but actually working together, co-parenting properly, showing courts that Abigail had two active involved parents who did not need outside interference. Mary wrapped her arms around herself, her voice small, as she said this was exactly what she feared 6 years ago. Mark's world trying to consume hers, his family deciding they knew what was best for her daughter. She said maybe she should have stayed gone, should never have taken that gallery commission where Mark would find them. Mark told her urgently not to say that Abigail deserved to know her father and Mary deserved support, that what his family was doing was wrong and they would fight it together. Mary whispered that maybe she was right all along, that their worlds could not coexist, that there was no place for her and Abigail in the Roberts family story. Mark said simply that he would leave the Roberts family story then, that he already cut ties with his mother over what she did years ago and would cut them completely now if that was what it took. He reminded Mary that the moment he found out what his family did to her, he chose her side, and he would do it again without hesitation. Mary studied his face for lies or manipulation, asking if he would really walk away from his family for them. Mark reminded her he already did when he learned the truth, that he just needed her to choose to trust him enough to fight this battle together. After long silence, Mary asked what exactly a united front looked like in practical terms, what it meant for their daily lives. Mark explained regular contact, joint decisions about Abigail's schooling and medical care and activities, presenting themselves as a team to courts and his family and anyone who asked, showing that Abigail had stable, loving environment with both parents involved. Mary asked what happened when his family figured out they were not actually a couple, when it became clear their unity was strategic rather than romantic. Mark met her eyes steadily and said who claimed it had to be just strategy, asking why they could not stop fighting what clearly still existed between them. Mary's breath caught as she told him they could not do this, but Mark pushed harder. He pointed out that they had a daughter together, were already in each other's lives constantly, clearly still felt something powerful between them. He asked why they should keep fighting it, instead of seeing where it went naturally. Mary said she could not survive him leaving again, that Abigail could not survive getting attached and then losing him, that this was too important to risk on feelings that might not last. Mark asked, what if the feelings did last? What if they were supposed to be exactly here getting a second chance to do this right? Before Mary could answer, Abigail appeared in the doorway, asking why they were talking about leaving, whether Mark was going away. Both adults exchanged guilty looks, and Mary quickly reassured their daughter it was just grown-up conversation, nothing for her to worry about. But Abigail said she heard them say someone wants to take her away, asking if they were sending her somewhere. Mary's face crumpled as she knelt down, pulling Abigail into fierce embrace. She promised no one was taking her anywhere, that she was staying right here always. Abigail asked over Mary's shoulder if she was staying with Mark too, and Mark moved to kneel beside them, confirming he would make sure Abigail stayed safe and happy with both her parents, that it was a promise he intended to keep no matter what it cost him. Later, after Abigail returned to her television show, Mary stayed kneeling on the floor with her face in her hands. She admitted she could not handle legal battles and family drama and custody fights, that she just wanted to raise her daughter in peace without constant threats. Mark told her gently it was their daughter, and she was not alone anymore, that whatever came next, they faced it together with no more carrying weight by herself. Mary looked up at him with tears on her cheeks, telling him that if they did this united front thing, he had to actually mean it. He could not disappear when things got hard, could not prioritize business over Abigail, could not let them down. Mark promised he would not fail them, that he failed her once by being too focused on work, but would never make that mistake again. Mary said sadly that people do not change that much, asking what happened when the next big deal came along, and the company needed him at the same moment Abigail did. Mark said without hesitation that he would choose Abigail every single time, no matter what it cost professionally, that she came first, always along with Mary. Mary studied his face looking for lies, for weakness, for any sign he did not mean it. Finally she nodded slowly, agreeing to try the united front, but warning that if he broke promises or let Abigail down, she would never forgive him and would make sure his family never got near their daughter either. Mark understood and accepted her terms, knowing he was asking for trust that would take time to rebuild, but determined to prove he was worthy of it. Chapter 7. The United Front. The following weeks were intensive preparation for potential legal battles that made Mark and Mary's lives completely intertwined. They met with lawyers repeatedly, building documentation showing Mark's involved parenting and Mary's excellent care, providing school records demonstrating Abigail's academic success and social development, medical records showing proper health care, financial statements showing Mary's stability. But the documentation required them to spend significant time together, coordinating answers, ensuring their stories aligned, presenting the unified front that would protect Abigail from Catherine's interference. This forced proximity began reshaping their relationship despite Mary's resistance. Mark started joining them for dinner several evenings weekly, helping with Abigail's homework, participating in bedtime routines that he learned through trial and error. He discovered that Abigail loved dinosaurs with passion that rivaled her art interest, was terrified of the dark and needed a nightlight constellation projector, had memorized every star pattern visible from her bedroom window. He read her stories with different voices for each character that made her giggle uncontrollably, learned how to braid her hair in the specific way she preferred, helped Mary prepare meals and clean up afterward. Mary watched him with cautious surprise, clearly expecting him to falter, to prioritize work commitments, to prove her right about his inability to sustain consistent presence. But Mark cancelled meetings without hesitation when Abigail needed him, rearranged his entire schedule around her activities, showed up reliably for every commitment he made, no matter how small. He was determined to prove through actions, rather than words, that he meant everything he promised. One evening after Abigail was asleep, they sat in Mary's living room reviewing documents for the lawyers, but the work had been abandoned in favor of exhausted silence. Mary finally spoke, her voice soft with something like wonder. She told him he was actually doing this, actually being a father and being present, that she kept waiting for him to revert to the man he was 6 years ago, but he was not that person anymore. Mark reminded her he told her he had changed, but Mary pointed out that people say many things, that promises are easy while actually keeping them is different. Mark asked what he needed to do to make her believe he meant this, what it would take for her to trust that he was not going anywhere. Mary was quiet, her fingers playing with document edges, as she admitted she supposed it took time, consistency over years, not just weeks or months, proving he would be there through hard stuff and not just easy moments. Mark told her simply that he could do years, could do however long it took to earn her trust completely. Mary challenged him, asking if he really could maintain this commitment when his company needed him for something critical, when there was a deal that could make or break everything he built, when choosing Abigail meant losing something professionally. Mark stated flatly that he would lose it professionally then, that he already told her Abigail came first along with Mary, that there was no scenario where he chose work over his daughter. Before Mary could respond, both their phones buzzed simultaneously with messages from Mark's lawyer. The text was brief but sent adrenaline spiking. Catherine Roberts had filed formal petition for grandparent visitation rights with court hearing scheduled in 3 weeks. Mary read her identical message, her face going pale as she realized Catherine actually did it, was really trying to take Abigail from her through legal means. Mark promised immediately that Catherine would not succeed, that they had everything documented, and their lawyer said the petition was weak, especially with them presenting united front. Mary's voice shook as she asked what if Catherine was not overplaying her hand, what if the judge decided Mary was not good enough, what if Abigail had to spend time with the Roberts family giving her opportunities Mary could not provide, what if she lost time with her daughter because Mark's family had better lawyers. Mark pulled Mary into his arms despite her resistance, promising that would never happen, that he would fight with everything he had to make sure Abigail stayed with Mary full-time. Mary allowed herself to lean into him briefly before pulling away and wiping her eyes roughly. She told him she needed to explain something about why custody battles terrified her so deeply. She described her father leaving when she was 8, her parents fighting for 2 years about custody and dragging her back and forth between them, using her as a weapon against each other. Every visit felt like being torn in half, every goodbye felt like abandonment, and eventually her father just stopped showing up for scheduled time, moved away, started a new family, and she became the child he forgot. Her voice was flat with old pain as she explained that was what she was terrified of for Abigail, not just losing time, but their daughter being pulled between families, feeling like she had to choose, experiencing that horrible sense of being a possession fought over rather than a person loved. She said she would rather run again and disappear completely than put Abigail through what she experienced as a child. Mark told her gently that she would not have to run, that Abigail would not be pulled between families because there was only one family that mattered. Mary, Mark, and Abigail together, not the Roberts family with their money and lawyers. Mary asked how he could make it sound simple when everything was so complicated. Mark suggested maybe they were making it complicated by overthinking everything, that they had a daughter who needed both parents, had clearly unresolved feelings for each other, had external forces trying to tear them apart. He asked why they should not just stop fighting what was already happening and commit to building something real instead of strategic. Mary laughed bitterly. asking if he expected them to ignore 6 years of hurt and betrayal and just become a family like that. Mark clarified, not ignore, but acknowledge, learn from it, and choose to move forward anyway. He said he was not asking her to forget what happened, but to believe they could build something better than what they lost, that they could create a future not defined by past mistakes. Before Mary could argue, Abigail's voice called from upstairs, asking if they were fighting again. Both adults immediately shifted their body language and expressions, and Mark went upstairs to find Abigail standing on the landing in her pajamas, clutching her stuffed rabbit and looking worried. She said she had a bad dream that they were yelling, and then Mark left and did not come back. Mary appeared behind Mark, her expression devastated as she realized their tension was affecting Abigail, even when they thought they were hiding it. Mark crouched down to Abigail's level, promising her seriously that he was not going anywhere, that he and her mama might have grown-up conversations that sounded serious, but it did not mean he was leaving. Abigail asked if he promised using her phrase for especially important commitments, and Mark confirmed he promised. He offered to take her back to bed and tell her a story to help her sleep better, and Abigail nodded while reaching for his hand. When Mark came back downstairs after settling Abigail with an elaborate story about a princess who painted magic pictures, Mary was crying silently on the couch. Mark sat beside her without touching, just present, and Mary whispered that Abigail was starting to depend on him, getting attached, and she was terrified he would let their daughter down, that he would prove Mary right about keeping him away, that Abigail would end up hurt because Mary let him into their lives. Mark said gently that another possibility was Abigail would grow up with a father who loved her, who showed up consistently, who proved that men could be reliable and present. She would learn that people could change, that mistakes could be forgiven, that families could be built even when they started from broken pieces. He told Mary he understood her fear, but they could not let it dictate their choices, could not let past trauma prevent them from building something better. Mary looked at him with tears streaming down her face, then admitted something that changed everything. She told him she was still in love with him, never stopped, spent 6 years trying to get over him and failed completely. And that terrified her more than anything Catherine could do, because Mark could destroy her in ways no court ever could. Mark started to respond, but Mary interrupted, telling him to let her finish explaining that she did not trust easily or forgive easily, that she did not know if she could let herself be vulnerable with him again, but she also could not keep pretending there was nothing between them. She told him if they were going to do this united front thing, if they were going to build something real for Abigail's sake, then he needed to understand the stakes. This was not just about co-parenting, but about whether she could risk her heart on him again, knowing exactly how much it would cost if he failed. Mark moved closer, cupping her face gently, promising he would not fail her this time. Mary whispered that he could not promise that, no one could, but Mark amended his promise to trying with everything he had, choosing her and Abigail over everything else, being present and consistent and honest, fighting for them every single day. Mary closed her eyes with tears leaking down her cheeks, saying this was such a bad idea. Mark agreed it probably was, but pointed out he had made much worse decisions in his life. He asked if he could kiss her, and Mary opened her eyes looking at him with expression mixing longing and fear. She told him if he kissed her everything changed, they could not go back to just co-parents. It became real and complicated and terrifying. Mark said good, that he wanted real and complicated, was done with safe and easy, wanted her with all the complications that came with it. Mary's resistance finally crumbled. She leaned forward, closing the distance between them, and kissed him with 6 years of suppressed hunger and desperate hope. Mark kissed her back with equal intensity, pouring every unspoken feeling into the connection. It was not gentle or tentative, but claiming and possessive. A statement that they were done pretending there was nothing between them. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Mary said they were going to regret this. Mark agreed absolutely while pulling her back in for another kiss that led to them making love on her couch with desperation that spoke of all the lost time and loneliness. Afterward, lying tangled together in darkness, Mary said quietly that if he hurt her again, she would actually kill him. Mark murmured fair enough while holding her tighter, and they fell asleep wrapped around each other, both terrified and hopeful in equal measure that maybe this time they could get it right. Chapter 8. The breaking and rebuilding morning brought awkwardness and uncertainty as Mary woke on the couch wrapped in Mark's arms, reality crashing back with uncomfortable clarity. She extracted herself carefully, checking on Abigail before Mark woke, needing space to process what they had done. Everything had changed in ways that could not be uncrossed, their co-parenting arrangement now infinitely more complex and emotionally dangerous. When Mark came upstairs, Mary handed him coffee without meeting his eyes. She told him Abigail would be up soon and they should probably talk about how to handle this new development. Mark asked carefully what she wanted to handle, and Mary finally looked at him, explaining they needed to discuss last night, what they were to each other now, how to avoid confusing Abigail. She admitted she wanted him but was terrified of that wanting, did not want their daughter getting hopes up about them being together if they were not sure it would work, but also could not pretend nothing happened. Mark suggested they stop pretending then, try being together for real and see where it went. Be honest with Abigail that they were figuring things out. Before Mary could respond, Abigail's voice called, asking if Mark was still there, her tone hopeful. Mary gave Mark a look that clearly communicated this was exactly what she meant, but she called back that yes, Mark had stayed over like a sleepover. Abigail appeared grinning widely, asking if they could have pancakes, and the domestic normalcy was jarring. The next days and weeks were intensive coordination for the custody hearing, requiring them to spend even more time together. But now their interactions were charged with new awareness. Lingering touches and meaningful glances complicated everything while they reviewed documents and prepared testimony. Mark stayed over more frequently, falling into routines of family dinners and shared bedtime responsibilities for Abigail. He and Mary were sleeping together regularly, their physical connection intense and consuming, but they still had not defined what they were doing or where it was heading beyond the strategic united front. Then everything crashed down simultaneously. Catherine escalated her campaign, hiring a private investigator who documented Mark spending nights at Mary's house. She reported this to the court as evidence of an unstable romantic relationship that complicated custody arrangements, arguing that if Mark and Mary were involved romantically but not married, it created confusing dynamics for Abigail and demonstrated lack of appropriate boundaries for the child's well-being. Simultaneously, Mary's father appeared without warning. She opened her door to find the man who abandoned her standing on her porch, smiling like he had any right to be there after more than a decade of silence. He claimed he had been trying to find her for years, mentioned hearing about his granddaughter through news coverage of the Roberts custody situation, said he would love to meet Abigail and spend time getting to know her because family was so important. Mary told him coldly to get off her porch, that he lost the right to call himself her father when he abandoned her and her mother. Her father corrected with oily familiarity that he meant his granddaughter, making clear he saw opportunity to connect with the wealthy Roberts family through Abigail. Mary understood immediately that he wanted access to money and status, using her daughter as his entry point. She threatened a restraining order if he ever tried contacting them again and slammed the door on his protests. When Mark arrived that evening, Mary was barely holding herself together. She told him about her father's visit, about Catherine's new tactics using their relationship against them, about feeling like everyone wanted a piece of Abigail without caring about who she actually was as a person. Her voice rose as she said she could not do this anymore, could not handle the custody battle and family threats, and her father showing up wanting money and trying to figure out her relationship with Mark while everything was chaos. She paced her living room like a caged animal, her control visibly cracking. Mark tried to reach for her, but Mary pulled away, her voice breaking as she said Mark being there was another complication, that they slept together and now his mother was using it against them in court, that her father showed up because news coverage connected her to his wealthy family, that everything was falling apart because she let him back into their lives. Mark tried to explain, but Mary cut him off, shouting that this was exactly what she feared, his world consuming hers, everyone wanting something from them. She said she thought she could handle this, thought she was strong enough, but she was not, that she was just a woman who got pregnant too young and had been scrambling to survive ever since. Her voice cracked completely as she said she was going to lose her daughter because she was stupid enough to trust him again. Mark told her firmly that she was not going to lose Abigail, but Mary demanded to know how he could promise that when his mother had lawyers and money and connections, while Mary's father would testify about her terrible childhood to show she was not stable. She said Mark and her together were proof that she made bad decisions, getting involved with Abigail's father while fighting for custody. Mary's tears streamed as she admitted every choice she made had been wrong, and Mark grabbed her shoulders, forcing her to look at him. He told her to stop and listen, that she was the strongest person he ever knew, that she raised Abigail through impossible circumstances and built a career from nothing. He said she survived when everything was stacked against her, and she should not let his family or her father or anyone else make her doubt herself. Mary whispered she was so tired of fighting and being strong and carrying everything alone, that she just wanted it to stop. Mark held her while she cried with great racking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep and ancient, years of being strong finally crashing down. He murmured that she was not alone anymore, that he was here and not going anywhere, that they would face everything together. But Mary pulled away, wiping her face roughly, telling him she needed him to leave right now because she could not think with him there, confusing everything. Mark wanted to argue, to stay and prove he could support her through crisis, but he saw the desperation in her eyes and understood that pushing now would only make things worse. He left reluctantly, and Mary spent the night pacing and crying, trying to sort through impossible tangles of emotions and problems. By morning, she had made a decision she knew was wrong, but felt necessary. She needed distance to clear her head and protect Abigail from all this chaos. She called her friend Felicia, the one person who supported her through everything, asking if she and Abigail could stay for a few days. Felicia agreed immediately, and Mary packed bags for both of them, told Abigail they were having a surprise vacation with Auntie Felicia, and left before Mark could show up for their scheduled evening together. She left him a note with devastating simplicity. "I can't do this. I'm sorry. Please don't look for us." When Mark arrived and found the note, his world imploded for the second time in 6 years. History was repeating itself, Mary running when things got hard, leaving him without answers or resolution or understanding. But this time he understood her better, knew why she ran, knew the terror that drove her decisions, and this time he was not going to let her go without fighting for what they had built together. Chapter 9. The Chase and Revelation. Mark did not hire investigators to find Mary this time. He knew her better now, understood how she thought, and where she would go when everything became too overwhelming to process. He remembered conversations about her friendship with Felicia, about the one person who had been there through early struggles and never judged. It took him only 3 hours of phone calls and internet searches to find Felicia's address in a small coastal town. He drove through the night, his mind cycling through everything that led to this moment, understanding that how he handled the next conversation would determine whether they had any future at all. When he arrived at dawn, Mary's car was parked outside a modest beach cottage, confirming his guess. Mark sat in his car, gathering courage, knowing he was about to either salvage everything or lose them permanently. Felicia answered his knock with immediate hostility, her expression protective and unwelcoming. She told him bluntly that Mary did not want to see him, but Mark said he understood that while needing to see her anyway. Felicia studied him with protective scrutiny before giving him 5 minutes with the warning that if Mary told him to leave, he left immediately. Mark nodded agreement, and Felicia led him to the back deck, where Mary sat watching sunrise, wrapped in a blanket, her face showing exhaustion of someone who had not slept. Mary stiffened when she saw him, but did not tell him to go, which Mark took as permission to stay. He asked quietly if they could talk just for a few minutes, and Mary stood reluctantly. They walked down to the shore in early morning light that painted everything soft colors, walking beside each other on sand without speaking for long time. Finally, Mark said simply that she ran, and Mary corrected that she left, insisting there was a difference. Mark challenged gently whether there really was a difference, pointing out that 6 years ago she ran when things got hard, and now she was doing it again. Mary's voice was tight as she explained things were not hard but impossible, listing the custody battle and her father's appearance and their undefined relationship complicating everything. She said running or leaving or whatever he wanted to call it was the only way she knew to protect Abigail from all the chaos. Mark stopped walking, forcing her to turn and face him, asking if she was protecting Abigail or protecting herself, because from his perspective she was running from fear rather than actual danger. Mary's eyes flashed with anger as she told him he had no idea what she was feeling, and Mark demanded she tell him then, stop assuming he could not understand, and actually talk to him. He asked her to explain why she left, what she was so afraid of, that she would rather run than fight. Mary shouted that she was afraid of losing Abigail, afraid his family would convince a judge she was not good enough, afraid her father would testify about her terrible childhood to show she was unstable, afraid she and Mark would mess up their daughter's life because they could not figure out their relationship. Mark pressed on, asking how running fixed any of that, and Mary screamed that it did not fix anything, but at least, if they left and disappeared, Abigail stayed with her. She did not have to risk losing her daughter to his family or courts or anyone else. Mark said quietly that except Mary lost him in that scenario, and Abigail lost her father again. Mary flinched at the truth of that statement, and Mark moved closer, with voice intense but not angry. He told her she talked about protecting Abigail, but what she was actually doing was teaching their daughter that when things got hard, people ran, that love meant abandoning people when they became complicated, that family was conditional based on circumstances rather than commitment. Mary tried to argue she was protecting Abigail from being pulled between families like she was as a child, from pain of being fought over and feeling like she had to choose. Mark said gently that Mary was protecting Abigail from her trauma, but her trauma was not their daughter's reality. He explained that Catherine was not Mary's father, that he was not going to abandon Abigail like her father abandoned her, that the custody battle was not the same situation she lived through as a child. Mary was projecting her past onto Abigail's present and running from ghosts instead of dealing with what was actually happening now. Mary was silent, his words hitting harder than she wanted to admit. Finally, she said quietly that 6 years ago she convinced herself leaving was selfless, that she was setting Mark free to build his empire without burden. Now she saw it was just fear, being terrified he would choose his career over her, so she made the choice for him, ran before he could leave her. Mark asked what about now, and Mary admitted she was terrified again, terrified she was not enough for him, that she would mess up this second chance, that she would fail Abigail by letting Mark into her life and then losing him, terrified that she loved him too much and it would destroy her when he inevitably proved she was right to keep her walls up. Mark cupped her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his eyes, telling her with intensity that matched hers that he was not leaving, not when things got hard, or when Catherine escalated, or when her father caused problems, or when they fought, or when he messed up, or when she pushed him away in fear. He promised he was staying, was committed, loved her and their daughter, and would prove every single day that she could trust him. Mary whispered that he could not promise that, but Mark said he just did and would keep promising until she believed him, would show up consistently until she stopped waiting for him to fail, would choose her and Abigail over everything else until she understood nothing was more important than their family. Mary asked what if she could not learn to trust him. What if the damage was too deep to heal completely? Mark said then they would work through it together slowly and patiently for however long it took, but they did not run from each other. They stayed and fought for what they had because what they had was worth fighting for. Mary closed her eyes with tears streaming, admitting she was so tired of being afraid. Mark offered to help carry it, told her she had been strong alone for 6 years but could let him be strong with her now. They stood on the beach holding each other while sun rose, both crying and exhausted and willing to try one more time to get this right. Finally, Mary pulled back, telling him she needed to explain something about why custody battles terrified her so deeply. She described being 8 when courts gave her father shared custody despite abandoning them, her mother trying to argue he was unreliable, the judge saying children deserved relationships with both parents. For 2 years, she waited for her father to show up for scheduled visits. Half the time he did not come, and she would sit by the window with her bag packed, hoping and breaking a little more each time he failed to appear. Eventually, he stopped coming entirely, moved to another city, started a new family, and she spent the rest of her childhood believing she was not worth staying for. Her voice was thick with old pain as she explained that was what terrified her about Catherine's custody battle, not full custody but visitation rights that would be used to control them, to judge them, to make Abigail feel never good enough for Robert's family standards. Or worse, that Catherine would get bored and stop showing up, leaving Abigail feeling the same abandonment Mary felt, and she could not protect her daughter from that if courts ordered it. Mark said firmly that they would make sure it never came to that his lawyers said Catherine's case was weak, especially with United Front. But more than that, he was going to handle his mother directly, make her understand that pursuing this would cost her everything. Mary said hopelessly that Catherine did not care, that she wanted control more than relationship with Mark. Mark acknowledged that might be true, but she was about to find out that he inherited her ruthlessness and used it to protect people he loved, not to control them. He asked Mary to come back with him, face this together, let him prove he would fight for their family with everything he had. Mary looked at ocean and sunrise and anything but Mark's intense gaze. Finally she said, if she came back, if she tried again. He needed to understand she was not the same person she was 6 years ago, that she was harder and more guarded and more damaged. Mark said he did not want to go backward but move forward with who they were now, 2 people who had been through hell and were choosing to build something new from the wreckage. Mary asked even if she was broken, and Mark told her fiercely she was not broken but a survivor, that he loved every scarred, guarded, fierce part of her, not despite what she had been through, but including it because it made her who she was. Mary finally looked at him, searching his face for lies, finding only honesty and determination. She nodded slowly, agreeing to go back, but warning that if he failed them, if he let Abigail down, there would not be a third chance, because this was it. Mark said he understood and he would not fail her, promising with everything he had. They returned to collect Abigail, who was delighted to see Mark and confused about the beach visit. They explained they had important things to talk about, but figured them out, and Abigail asked with child's directness whether they were going to be together like married people. Mary looked at Mark and said carefully they were figuring that out, but what mattered was that they both loved Abigail and would make sure she had everything she needed. Abigail announced she wanted them together so they could be a real family, and Mark told her they were already a real family because families came in lots of different shapes, and what made them real was loving each other and sticking together no matter what. They drove back to the city together with Abigail chattering in the back seat, Mark and Mary stealing glances at each other, both terrified and hopeful that maybe this time they would get it right because the alternative of losing each other again was unacceptable. The custody battle was still ahead, Catherine's threats remained real, Mary's father might cause more problems, and their relationship was fragile and undefined. But for the first time they were facing everything together instead of alone, and maybe that would be enough to survive what came next. Chapter 10. The Reunion. The custody hearing arrived with brutal speed after weeks of intensive preparation. Mark and Mary sat beside each other in the courtroom, their lawyers flanking them, facing Catherine Roberts and her legal team across the aisle. The proceedings were cold and formal, nothing like the emotional chaos of real life, but the stakes could not have been higher for everyone involved. Catherine's lawyer presented their case methodically. Abigail deserved to know her paternal family. Mary had deliberately hidden the child for years. Mark's involvement was too recent to demonstrate real commitment, and grandparent visitation would benefit the child's development and opportunities. They painted Mary as someone who made questionable choices, referenced the eviction proceedings from years ago, suggested her current success was too recent to be considered stable. Mark's lawyer countered with a different narrative. Mary was an exemplary mother who raised Abigail through difficult circumstances. Mark was now fully involved and supportive. They co-parented cooperatively, making joint decisions, and they presented a stable, loving environment. Catherine's sudden interest after 6 years of absence suggested motives beyond Abigail's well-being. Mark testified about his commitment to Abigail, his regular presence in her life, his future plans. Mary testified about Abigail's happiness, her excellent school performance, her stable home. Character witnesses spoke to Mary's parenting and Mark's transformation from absent father to dedicated parent. The judge listened, asked pointed questions, reviewed documents, then adjourned to consider her decision. 3 days later, the ruling arrived. Catherine's petition was denied. The judge ruled that Abigail had a stable, loving home with 2 involved parents who demonstrated excellent co-parenting. There was no evidence that denying Catherine access would harm the child, and significant evidence that forcing a relationship with grandparents who had shown no prior interest could be disruptive. The decision was final. Mary started crying with relief when Mark called her with the news. That evening, Mark arrived with champagne and Abigail's favorite takeout. They told their daughter the good news in age-appropriate terms, and Abigail announced she was happy, asking if they could celebrate with ice cream. They celebrated with ice cream and an impromptu dance party, Abigail giggling as Mark spun her while Mary laughed. It felt like family in ways nothing had felt normal in months. After Abigail went to bed, Mark and Mary sat with untouched champagne, months of stress finally lifting. Mary asked quietly what happened now that the custody battle was over, whether they still needed the united front or could go back to just co-parenting. Mark asked if that was what she wanted, and Mary admitted no, but did not know what going forward looked like now that external pressure was gone. Mark said he wanted her, not because of custody battles or external pressure, but because he loved her and never stopped. He wanted to build a life together, marry her, raise Abigail together, maybe even give her siblings someday. He wanted forever with her because the woman she had become through struggle was the woman he wanted to spend his life beside. Mary's eyes filled with tears as she said he made it sound simple, and Mark suggested maybe it was, that the hard part was behind them and now they just chose each other every day. Mary admitted she was still scared and waiting for something to go wrong, but Mark said he would keep proving it would not for as long as it took her to believe this was real. Then he pulled out a ring, kneeling before her with a sapphire surrounded by stones that caught light like stars. He asked her to marry him not for practical reasons, but because he loved her more than he thought possible, because she was the strongest, most incredible person he ever knew, because he wanted to spend every day proving he was worthy of her and Abigail. Mary cried openly as she looked at the ring and his face and the life he was offering. Every instinct screamed at her to protect herself and refuse because accepting meant vulnerability that terrified her. But she also saw truth in his eyes, commitment and love that survived 6 years and every obstacle. She whispered yes, and Mark slid the ring on her finger before pulling her into a kiss that tasted like tears and champagne and promises finally kept. They woke Abigail to tell her, and she was thrilled, asking if she could be in the wedding and wear a fancy dress. They laughed while holding their daughter between them, and Mark caught Mary's eye over Abigail's head in a look that held gratitude and hope and love and relief of finally being exactly where they belonged. Months passed. They merged households gradually, Mark moving into Mary's townhouse because it was already Abigail's home. Mary accepted the Paris commission she once considered, but this time Mark and Abigail came with her, spending months in France while Mary worked. They married in a small ceremony at the gallery where Mark first saw his daughter, surrounded by Mary's paintings. The portrait that started everything hung prominently, Abigail in sunflowers, the portrait of truth that brought them back together. Mary painted a new piece for their wedding, 2 figures walking toward a horizon with a child between them, showing their faces clearly along with scars and healing. She titled it Rebuilt, and it hung in their home as a reminder that broken things pieced back together with care become stronger than they ever were before. Catherine was not at the wedding, unable to apologize to Mary or acknowledge her role. Mark grieved the relationship but did not regret his choice. Mary's father tried contacting them once more, met with legal threats that ended his attempts. They focused on building their family instead of wasting energy on people who proved they cared more about control than genuine relationships. Abigail thrived, growing into a confident child who knew she was loved unconditionally. 2 years after their wedding, Mary gave Abigail a sibling, a son they named James. Abigail was thrilled to be a big sister, helping with bottles and diapers and singing the baby to sleep. On James's first birthday evening, after the party ended and both children were asleep, Mark and Mary stood in their home gallery surrounded by Mary's artwork, documenting their journey. There were dark, powerful pieces from her years alone, chaotic works from their reconciliation, and new, vibrant pieces showing a family that survived everything. Mary asked quietly if he ever regretted everything he gave up for them, and Mark kissed her head, saying never, not once, that she and their children were the best thing that ever happened to him. Mary leaned into him, finally able to accept his words, without waiting for abandonment, without the fear that had defined her for so long. They had built something real from the ashes of what they lost, something stronger because it was forged through fire. This was their portrait of truth, not idealized or perfect, but honest and hard-won and beautiful in its complexity. A family rebuilt from broken pieces, held together by love that proved stronger than every force that tried to tear them apart. And it was more than enough. It was everything. The end.